Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes. Today, we're going to be diving into Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha.
Oh, yes. Yes. It's one of those books that, I think really sticks with you.
Yeah, a lot of people consider it a classic,
It
and,
is a classic.
and for good reason. So, before we unpack all that, can you give our listeners just a quick rundown of what Siddhartha is about?
So basically, Siddhartha is about this guy, Siddhartha, and he's a young Brahmin in ancient India. And the whole book is about his journey to find enlightenment.
Mm.
And he tries all these different paths. Like, he starts out with this really strict kind of aesthetic lifestyle.
Yeah,
And then he goes to the opposite end of the spectrum and indulges in all kinds of worldly pleasures. But ultimately, the book is really about him moving beyond, those rigid doctrines that he's been taught
right.
and finding his own way to, understanding and peace.
So it's like a journey inward as much as it is outward.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that the book really drives home is that true enlightenment, it's not about just blindly following what other people tell you. It's
Yeah.
about actually going out and living your life and learning from the things that happen to you.
Yeah. So where does Siddhartha's journey begin?
Well, the book starts with him as a young man. He's already feeling kind of dissatisfied with the traditional religious practices of his family and upbringing.
Yeah, even though he's mastered them all right.
Yeah, he's super smart. He understands these really complex concepts like Atman, which is this idea that there's a universal self that connects everything in the universe. But for him, it's not enough to just intellectually understand it. He wants to experience it. He wants to feel that connection for real.
Yeah. It's like that yearning for something more that I think a lot of us can relate to.
Totally. And that yearning, it leads him and his friend Govinda to leave their comfortable lives and join this group of wandering ascetics called the Samanas, who basically practice extreme self-denial, They believe that by detaching from the physical world and their senses that they can find enlightenment.
So he goes from a life of privilege to basically nothing.
Pretty much. And it's not easy. He
So-
learns to control his breath. He learns to endure pain. He even learns to perceive the world from the perspective of animals and inanimate objects. It's like he's pushing himself to the limit, trying to transcend his physical self.
There's that scene where they meet that Samana, who has complete control over his body. It's almost like he's achieved a supernatural state.
Yeah, and that scene, it's like a turning point for them
Yeah.
because it shows them that what they're striving for, it's actually possible.
Yeah.
But after years of this intense discipline, Siddhartha starts to realize that this path, it's not actually leading him to true enlightenment.
It's like he hits a wall.
Yeah, totally. And he comes to understand that escaping himself through deprivation and denial, it's not the answer. It's still a form of running away. He's not truly confronting what's going on inside him.
So what does he do? Does he just go back to his old life?
Not quite. Around this time, rumors start spreading about this guy named Gautama the Buddha,
Okay.
who has supposedly achieved enlightenment and is teaching people how to be liberated from suffering. And Govinda Siddhartha's friend, he's immediately drawn to the Buddha. He's like, yes, finally a new teacher to follow.
Yeah.
But Siddhartha, he's a little hesitant.
Yeah, it's interesting how their paths diverge here.
It is.
Govinda is ready to jump right in and follow this new, enlightened figure, and Siddhartha's a little bit more cautious.
Yeah, and I think that really shows the difference between them.
Yeah.
Even as a young man, Siddhartha has this understanding that you can't find enlightenment just by following someone else. There's this great line in the book where he's talking to the Buddha, and he says, to believe is to anticipate, but to know is not to hope. To know is to be free of hope. And it's like he's saying real wisdom, it has to come from within.
Yeah.
From your own experience of life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So even though he respects the Buddha, he senses that this isn't his path.
Exactly. And it takes a lot of courage to walk away from something that everyone else thinks is so great.
Yeah, for sure. So what happens next? I mean, he's rejected the traditional religious practices of his upbringing, the aesthetic path of the Samanas. He's even met the Buddha and decided not to follow him. Where does he go from there?
Well, this is where things start to get really interesting. Siddhartha realizes that he spent his whole life trying to escape himself. He's either been trying to transcend the physical world or he's been immersed in all these spiritual practices. But he's never really explored what it means to be human, to experience life in all its messy glory.
Right. So it's like he's finally ready to stop running away and actually face himself.
Yeah. He decides to embrace the world of the senses, to really experience life fully and without judgment. And this is a huge shift for him. He goes from denial to acceptance.
And this leads him to Kamala.
Yeah, Kamala, the beautiful courtesan,
Yeah.
she represents the allure of the senses, the pleasure of the material world. She teaches him about love, desire, the art of seduction.
It's quite a contrast from, extreme asceticism to a life of pleasure and indulgence.
It is, but it's important to remember that Siddhartha, he's not just looking for pleasure, he's trying to understand the world.
Yeah.
And that includes the world of the senses. So he learns about business from this wealthy merchant named Kamaswami, and he becomes really successful. Like, he makes a ton of money and enjoys the finer things in life, but he never fully loses himself in it.
And it's like he's playing a role. He's not really attached to any of it.
Exactly. He's observing, he's learning, but he doesn't let himself get too attached. He sees the material world as kind of a game, a temporary illusion.
Yeah.
But even with this detached perspective, he eventually starts to feel a sense of weariness.
So even achieving success and experiencing all this pleasure, it's still not enough.
Right. He sees the emptiness of a life that's only focused on material gain and gratification. And he starts to change. He starts oversleeping. He loses patience with his business partner. And then he has this dream where he sees signs of age and weariness on Kamala.
So even Kamala's beauty and the pleasure that she represents, it's not enough to satisfy him.
No. And this dream is like a symbol of how fleeting all these things are, It makes him realize that this path, it's not going to lead him where he wants to go either.
So he's at another crossroads.
He is. He's rejected the spiritual path of his childhood, the ascetic path of the samanas, the teachings of the Buddha, and now even the path of worldly success and pleasure. He's totally lost and he doesn't know where to turn.
Wow. That's quite a journey already, and we're just scratching the surface.
Right.
So where does he go from here?
Well, it's at this moment of complete despair that he finds himself by the river again. The same river that he crossed years ago when he first set out on his spiritual quest. And it's here by the river that he's going to have to face his deepest fears and finally find his way to true enlightenment.
Oh, wow. Can't wait to hear what happens next.
Yeah. So yeah, he's really at this like rock bottom,
Yeah.
He's standing by the river and he's actually thinking about ending it all.
Wow.
And it's a pretty heavy image, like it shows just how lost we can feel when we've tried everything we can think of on the outside and we haven't really looked within.
Right.
But then something happens that stops him from going through with it.
Yeah.
He remembers the word Yeah, it's the sacred syllable that in Hinduism and Buddhism represents like the fundamental unity of the universe. It's kind of like this lifeline that connects him back to something bigger than himself.
Yeah.
And it reminds him that everything is connected. Everything is part of this one big whole.
It's like a little moment of grace in the middle of all this darkness.
Exactly. And it's right by the river that he meets this guy named Vasudeva.
Oh, Vasudeva the ferryman, right?
Yeah.
I always liked him. He was a really interesting character.
He is. He's got this really simple wisdom, It's not based on any kind of teachings or doctrines. It's just this deep, intuitive understanding of life.
Yeah, and that comes from listening to the river, right?
Yeah.
Like he's learned so much just by paying attention to nature.
Exactly. And Siddhartha, he sees that right away. He recognizes a kindred spirit in Vasudeva, someone who really knows how to listen.
Yeah, and Siddhartha really needs that right now.
Yeah.
I mean, he's tried so many different paths. He's talked to so many wise people, but it's like he's still searching for something.
And he's drawn to Vasudeva's quiet strength, and his ability to just be present with people without judging them.
Yeah, that's a pretty rare quality.
It is. So Siddhartha decides to stay with Vasudeva and learn from him. He becomes a ferryman himself and finds this sense of peace in just this simple act of helping people cross the river.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful metaphor for life, isn't it? Like we're all just trying to get to the other side of something.
Yeah, and along the way, we help each other out.
And it's through this experience that Siddhartha really starts to understand the river's wisdom. Like how the river is present at its source and at its mouth and everywhere in between all at the same time.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite passages in the book.
Yeah, me too.
It's such a powerful image of how everything is connected. The past, the present, the future. It's all happening at once.
Yeah, like time is just an illusion.
Exactly. And Siddhartha learns to let go of his attachment to specific outcomes, to just embrace the flow of life as it comes.
It's like he's finally learning to surrender.
Yeah.
But then life throws him a curveball.
It does.
Kamala's son.
Yeah, his past comes back to him in a way that he never expected.
Right. After all those years of seeking enlightenment, he suddenly has to deal with being a father.
And it brings up all these new challenges for him, He wants to protect his son from suffering, but he also knows that everyone has to find their own path.
Yeah, that's tough. It's like the classic dilemma of being a parent. You want to shield your kids from pain, but you also know that they need to experience life for themselves.
And it's interesting how Siddhartha's own father went through the same thing, right? Like, Siddhartha left his family to go on his own spiritual journey. And now he's on the other side of that equation.
Right. There's that really sad scene where Siddhartha's son rebels and steals money and runs away.
Yeah.
And it's like this reminder that we can't control other people's lives, even our own children.
That's a hard lesson to learn.
Yeah.
And in trying to find his son, Siddhartha ends up back at Kamala's garden.
Oh, wow.
And all these memories and emotions come flooding back.
It's like the past is catching up with him.
It is. And it forces him to confront all these unresolved issues that he's been carrying around with him for years.
Yeah. And then he goes back to the river again?
He does, but this time the river's not so gentle with him. It's like it's holding up a mirror and showing him his own flaws.
Yeah, I remember that part where the river laughs at him.
Yeah, it's like it's mocking his struggle with ego and attachment. Like, dude, you're still trying to control everything.
And he realizes that he's doing the same thing that his father did.
Yeah, he's repeating the same patterns even though he's tried so hard to break free from them.
It's like he's come full circle.
He has. And it's both devastating and liberating,
Yeah.
Devastating because it shows him how deeply ingrained these patterns are, but also liberating because it forces him to finally surrender.
Yeah.
To let go of the need to control everything.
And that's when he really starts to hear what the river's saying, right?
Yeah, it's not just about longing anymore. It's about the whole spectrum of human experience.
Yeah.
The joy and the sorrow, the laughter and the tears, the life and the death.
Whole shebang.
Yeah, and he sits by the river with Vasudeva, listening deeply. And he has this vision of himself, his father, and his son all flowing together like part of this one big river.
Oh.
And they're all going through the same cycles of suffering and seeking.
And he finally understands.
He does. He reaches this state of enlightenment, but it's not like this blissful detachment.
Yeah.
It's this profound acceptance of everything as it is,
Yeah.
like surrendering to the river's flow.
So what happens to Vasudeva?
Well, Vasudeva, he knows that Siddhartha has finally found what he was looking for. So he says goodbye and leaves peacefully.
Oh, wow.
And Siddhartha's just sitting there by the river contemplating everything he's learned. And then who should show up but Govinda?
Govinda. His old friend.
Yeah, the one who left to follow the Buddha all those years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Govinda shows up after all these years. He's been searching for enlightenment and following the Buddha's teachings and stuff.
And he doesn't recognize Siddhartha, right?
Nope.
Not at first, anyway.
He's become a totally different person.
He has. All those years of searching and struggling and experiencing life have transformed him.
So what happens when Govinda finally realizes who he is?
Well, he's blown away,
Yeah.
He sees how much peace and wisdom Siddhartha has, and he wants to know how he got there. Like, what's the secret? But I bet it's not so easy to explain, is it? Like, how do you put enlightenment into words?
Exactly. And that's what Siddhartha tells him. He says that wisdom can't be taught. It can only be experienced.
So it's not about following a set of rules or anything.
No. It's about listening to your own inner voice, paying attention to the world around you, and learning from every experience.
So it's more about the journey than the destination.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
And Siddhartha even tells Govinda to look to the river, Like find wisdom in the simplest things in nature.
That's interesting because it seems like a different approach than what the Buddha taught, right? Like the Buddha was all about detachment from the world and getting rid of desire.
Yeah, and that's something that Govinda brings up too. But Siddhartha says that even the Buddha, even though he recognized that everything is impermanent, he still felt compassion and love for people.
So it's not about suppressing your emotions, but about understanding them and accepting them as part of life.
Exactly. And Govinda has a hard time wrapping his head around this, He spent his whole life trying to achieve enlightenment through discipline and renunciation.
Right. And now Siddhartha is saying that the key is to embrace life fully.
Yeah. And what's really amazing is that Siddhartha actually gives Govinda a taste of what he's talking about. He asks Govinda to kiss him on the forehead.
Okay.
And in that moment, Govinda experiences a glimpse of Siddhartha's enlightenment. He sees the interconnectedness of everything and feels this incredible sense of peace and joy.
Wow. So it's like a direct transmission of wisdom beyond words or teachings.
Exactly. And it leaves Govinda in awe, Like he's seen something truly profound.
That's such a beautiful ending to the story.
It is. It reminds us that enlightenment isn't about reaching some distant goal. It's about waking up to the present moment and seeing the beauty and wonder that's all around us.
Yeah, and that anyone can achieve it if they're willing to look within and listen to their own inner voice.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into Siddhartha.
It has.
I think it's a book that everyone should read at least once in their lives.
I agree.
It's a story that stays with you and makes you think about the big questions, like what does it really mean to be alive, and how can we find true happiness and fulfillment?
Yeah, and it encourages us to keep searching, keep questioning, and never stop learning.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, and I hope it's inspired you to explore Siddhartha for yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep listening to that river song.